In the heart of the mystical realm where ancient curses meet modernity, Whispers of the Enchanted Embers weaves a captivating tale that intertwines family bonds, love, redemption, and the quest for identity. Rhys Penhallow, a reluctant heir to an age-old magical dynasty, returns to his ancestral village in the drizzling rain, symbolically echoing his conflicted reception. His journey unfolds a story of self-discovery, challenging family dynamics, and unearthing secrets hidden beneath the layers of his bloodline's history. Scarlett Let Ellsworth, a vibrant and fiercely independent editor-in-chief, enters Rhys' life, stirring up more than just a storm of emotions. Their fiery encounters, from accidental collisions to tender moments in the shadows of Paris, reflect a love story defying societal norms and expectations. Their bond evolves, testing the boundaries of power dynamics, ambition, while navigating the treacherous territories of trust in a world where alliances can shift. The narrative's highlight lies in Rhys' transformation, from an indifferent outsider in his birthright to a man embracing his role with a newfound purpose. The unexpected alliance with Scarlett, his confidant and lover, adds depth, revealing his vulnerability and strength to confront his family's darkest shadows. Crewe's unexpected depth of character growth and his love storylines create a poignant balance between love, loyalty, and the consequences of power dynamics in a world where love can be both a weapon and shield. Whispers of the Enchanted Embers captivates with its blend of mystery, romance, fantasy, and intrigue. It's a journey where love is tested not just between hearts, but also in the embers of legacy and ambition. With its backdrop of Parisian charm and highborn courts, the novel whispers a tale of love that burns bright amidst the embers of tradition and the enchantment, igniting the path towards a future where love can redeem even the most cursed of pasts. Chapter 1. Home. The moment Lindy Carmichael turned down Apple Orchard Lane in Wenatchee, Washington, she released a deep sigh. An immediate sense of familiar warmth and welcome filled her. She had 2 full weeks off to celebrate Christmas and New Year's with her family. If ever she needed a break, it was this year. And what a truly terrible, awful year it had been. 3 years ago, after working for several small companies, Lindy had been hired for her dream job with a marketing and website design company. Her degree in computer science with a specialty in graphics and visualization, plus her work history, was tailor-made for Media Blast. Confident that her creative talent would be a company asset, she'd been sure she'd fit right in. While she loved her job and the opportunity it afforded her, she couldn't help feeling underappreciated. Just before Lindy left for vacation, she'd submitted a campaign for the Ferguson Group, one of their largest accounts. This opportunity to prove her worth was exactly what she'd been waiting for. If her proposal was chosen, then she would get the recognition she deserved. Lindy had never been a quitter. Her dad had once told her that if she did more than she was paid to do, her hard work would eventually be noticed. With time, she'd be rewarded for what she did. Lindy held on to that philosophy and had given this job her all. Pushing thoughts of work problems from her mind, she pulled into the driveway of the home where she'd spent the majority of her life. Twinkling lights lining the edge of the roofline greeted her, along with twin reindeer who stood guard over the snow-covered lawn. A large evergreen wreath with silver and blue bulbs hung on the front door. Home for Christmas. This was exactly what she needed to escape the doldrums that had plagued her over the last 6 months. Lindy hadn't completely exited her car before the front door flew open and her mother and Beau, the family dog, hurried toward her on the freshly shoveled driveway. Her mother's arms reached for Lindy, while Beau braced his front legs against her thighs, tail wagging, craving her attention. With barely enough time to inhale the shockingly cold air, Lindy was pulled inside the warm house by her mother, who then enveloped her in a full-body hug. Beau barked his welcome, running circles around her, yipping his excitement. "I didn't think you'd ever get here," Ellen Carmichael said, helping Lindy off with her coat. "How was the pass?" "I checked the weather conditions and it was snowing over Snoqualmie. Did you have any trouble?" "I worry that you don't have snow tires. I realize you don't need them living in Seattle, but it's a must this side of the mountains." "Mom, my goodness, give me a minute to catch my breath," Lindy said, giggling. Home. To be surrounded by love was what she needed most. The kitchen was warm, and her mother had a batch of freshly baked cookies lined up in rows on the countertop. Baking was an expression of love in Lindy's family. Her mother started early for the annual Christmas Eve gathering with longtime friends. Each family would leave with an overflowing plate of homemade cookies. "Did you eat breakfast?" her mother asked her as she reached for the coffee pot. "No. I wanted to get on the road as soon as it was daylight." Traffic over Snoqualmie Pass could be a problem in winter, and it was often closed due to avalanche concerns. Lindy felt the earlier she got out of Seattle and to the other side of the mountain, the better. "Then sit down and I'll fry you up." Lindy cut her mother off, eyeing the cookies on the countertop. Coffee and a couple of those thumbprints will carry me until lunchtime. Her mother opened the cupboard for a mug, while Lindy helped herself to her favorite Christmas cookies. Sitting across from her, Lindy smiled at her mother. This was what she'd held in her mind for the last several months while she weathered the storms life had tossed at her. Home and Christmas. This was the perfect combination to help her out of this deep emotional slump. Her position with Media Blast was only the tip of the proverbial iceberg. Not wanting her mother to fret, Lindy had kept the majority of her various troubles since summer to herself, nor was she looking to share them the minute she arrived home. Maybe in a few days, after she'd soaked in the serenity of being at home, she would feel inclined to explain. After sampling the first cookie, Lindy closed her eyes. I swear I could eat a dozen of these. But you won't. I have lunch planned. Only then did Lindy notice the simmering pot on the stove. Did you make pasta e fagioli? The soup, made with cannellini and kidney beans and small pasta simmering in a rich tomato broth, was a family tradition. With sourdough buns, her mother added. The starter had been handed down from her father's grandfather, who'd once lived in Alaska. He claimed it came from an old Klondike miner, and had been kept alive since the 1890s. Lindy knew her parents had shared it with various family and friends. For as long as she could remember, Lindy's father had made sourdough pancakes every Sunday morning for breakfast. On special occasions her mother baked the buns, using a recipe that had been passed down from her grandmother. Mom, Lindy said and groaned, you're going to spoil me. That's exactly what I intend to do. It's been far too long since you've been home. I was here for the 4th of July, she reminded her. She'd come home shortly after getting her own apartment, and just before she'd learned the terrible truth about, she stopped her thoughts, refusing to let them drift toward even more unpleasantness. Yes, and that was months ago. It isn't like we're 1,000 miles apart. Seattle is barely 3 hours away in traffic. I know, but I moved, remember, and then there was this project for work that demanded nearly every weekend. But it was worth it because I earned 2 weeks off to spend the holidays with you, Dad, Chad, Ashley, and Peter. Her younger brother had married his high school sweetheart and worked at the Apple warehouse in supply chain management. Within a year, Ashley and Chad had presented her parents with an amazing grandson. Lindy was crazy about 4-year-old Peter. They connected every week through FaceTime, and she mailed him gifts so often, Chad had to ask her to resist. Ashley was currently pregnant with a little girl they had decided to name Grace. She was due to arrive the first week of March. When Lindy finished her coffee and cookies, she unloaded her car and brought her suitcase into her bedroom. Standing in the doorway to the familiar room, she found it exactly as it had been when she'd left for college. She sat on the edge of her bed and looked around, remembering how carefree life had been when she was a teenager. A poster of the Jonas Brothers was tacked to one wall. Her pom-poms from dance team were tucked against the corner of the bulletin board, and the corsage she'd worn to her senior prom was pinned to the board. Home. Peace washed over her, as she wrapped all that was familiar around her like a heated blanket. Lunch will be ready soon, her mother called from the kitchen, soon after Lindy had unpacked. She tucked the few wrapped gifts she'd brought with her under the Christmas tree that adorned the living room, in front of the picture window that looked out over Apple Orchard Lane. I'll be right there. After admiring the tree, Lindy joined her mother, who had already dished up 2 steaming bowls of soup. The breadbasket sat in the middle of the table, along with a butter dish. After a simple grace, Lindy lifted her spoon. I dreamed about this soup. It never tastes the same when I make it, and I follow the recipe to the letter. Somehow it always tastes better when you cook it. That's because it's made with love. Lindy wanted to discount this extra ingredient that her mother insisted made the difference. How could she, though, when there didn't seem to be any other explanation? Her mother waited until Lindy had finished her lunch before she paused, her eyes serious. Looking directly at Lindy, she said, I'm waiting. Waiting for what? Lindy asked. Waiting for you to tell me what's going on with you, and please don't try to brush this off. You'd best tell me before. Mom, there's nothing. With narrowed eyes, her mother waved her index finger like a clock's pendulum. Lindy Rose, I'm your mother. No one knows you better than me. I've suspected for quite some time you're unhappy. Now spill. Lindy was afraid that once she started, she might not be able to stop. It's more than work, isn't it? Her mother did know her. Yes, Lindy confirmed. There's more to the story of my split with Brian. Lindy had told her parents they'd broken up, but she hadn't gone into the details. She couldn't. It was too painful then and only a little less so now. You were rather vague about the reasons. With cause. A majority of what happened were things she'd prefer to keep to herself. Did it have to do with you getting that apartment? Apparently, her parents were good at reading between the lines. Lindy nodded. It was that and so much more. I remember in July that you mentioned your relationship with Brian had changed. It was not long afterward that you decided to go your separate ways. Shortly after she returned to Seattle, Lindy had learned the truth about Brian and Celeste, and it had devastated her. You cared for him, right? Yeah. Lindy had. Deeply. Early in their relationship, she could see them marrying and building a life together. Once she'd achieved her career goals. She enjoyed his company, but as time progressed, she could see Brian wasn't ready for marriage. And for that matter, neither was she. Marriage was a huge commitment. Are you sorry the two of you broke up? Definitely not, she said emphatically. Her mother's eyebrows rose close to her hairline. Your reaction tells me there's a whole lot more going on that you haven't mentioned. Lindy's shoulders slumped slightly. She hadn't intended to get into this quite so soon. Now with her mother probing for answers, Lindy felt like she didn't have a choice. She might as well get it over with. Learning what Celeste, her one-time best friend, and Brian had done wasn't something she relished telling her mother. Her mother paused as she waited for Lindy to continue. Lindy knew her mother intended to give her time until she was comfortable enough to explain. When the lease on Celeste and my apartment was close to being up, Lindy said after several pain-filled moments, we knew it was time for us each to get our own place. Lindy's heart actually hurt as she relayed the events of the summer. Celeste was working in Edmonds. That meant she had nearly an hour commute through the heavy Seattle traffic. It made sense for her to look for an apartment closer to her job. Apartments in Seattle are at a premium, but I found one pretty easily. It was in an older complex, and a friend who was moving had told her about it. Lindy quickly snapped it up. Celeste wasn't so lucky. It took us weeks to find a place she could afford. She saw one she liked that was out of her price range and went for it. I figured she was better at budgeting than I realized. Her mother continued to listen, not asking a lot of questions, which Lindy appreciated. We made plans to move, vowing to stay in touch no matter what. They'd been roommates and best friends since their college days, and had met during their freshman year. It would be the first time they'd lived apart since they were 18. In retrospect, Lindy should have known something was wrong. Celeste signed a lease on an apartment she couldn't afford? Lindy nodded, avoiding eye contact. How did she manage that? She got a roommate, Lindy said. For a one-bedroom unit? Lindy glanced up. She'd met a guy. I didn't know Celeste was in a serious relationship. I didn't either. That was the crux of it. Lindy had been oblivious to what was happening between her best friend and Brian. Her mother frowned. What aren't you telling me? Her roommate is Brian. The two of them had been going apartment hunting behind my back for weeks. I was stupidly blind, trusting them both. No. Her mother gasped. Brian moved in with Celeste? Even though she'd learned the truth months ago. A sick feeling churned in Lindy's stomach. Well, that weasel. That's not the worst of it. Earlier, when Celeste and I decided it was time for us to find our own spaces, Brian had suggested the two of us move in together. I turned him down. I wasn't ready for that kind of commitment. Then, all of a sudden, he called and canceled several dates we'd made. I thought it was his passive-aggressive way of getting back at me for refusing to share the apartment. He's a jerk, Lindy. A real jerk. Her mother's words were tame compared to how Lindy thought of her ex-boyfriend's actions. Shortly after we moved out of the apartment, I stopped off to see about helping Celeste unpack. I hadn't heard from her since the move and knew she was working long hours and could probably use the help. I'd sent her a couple of text messages that she hadn't responded to, and I was concerned. Imagine my surprise when I arrived and Brian answered the door. Oh, Lindy, I'm so sorry. Lindy had no intention of discounting the betrayal she'd felt in that moment. It was bad enough that Brian had cheated on her with Celeste, but for her best friend to go behind her back this way was even worse. Heartache from a broken romance was something she'd experienced before. Johnny Bemis had broken her heart when she was in high school. Her friends had rallied around her, and she'd gotten over him quickly. This was different. To lose her best friend, her confidant, the one person in Seattle who supported and believed in her, was a double hit. She missed Celeste's company far more than she did Brian's. Even now, it was hard to believe Celeste would betray and deceive her this way. So much for the friend's code of honor. It stinks, Lindy said. The thing is, Mom, I'm a complete romantic failure. Saying it aloud made it seem all the more real. Don't say that. How can I not? Mardell and Nate are engaged and have already adopted a dog they named Oscar. She asked me to be a bridesmaid in her wedding this summer. And Mardell isn't the only one of my college friends who is in a committed relationship. I know what Celeste and Brian did hurts. No kidding. She hadn't meant to blurt out all this drama the instant she walked in the front door. Lindy had hoped to put all this behind her and enjoy the holidays with her family. The less she thought about Brian and Celeste, the better all around. I'm sorry you had to go through this. Her mother's gentle sympathy helped ease the ache in her heart. Thank you, Mom. While my head knows that, my heart is having a hard time accepting it. I can understand that. Her mother was right. Still, Lindy found it hard to believe. It's my own fault. I made the mistake of checking Celeste's page on Facebook last night, and while I was spending my weekends alone, the two of them were skiing on White Pass and attending a Seahawks football game. What hurts most is those are the very activities Brian and I did last winter. I'm such a loser. You most certainly aren't a loser, Lindy Rose Carmichael. I lost my boyfriend and my best friend. Losing Brian isn't so bad, but Celeste? I have lots of friends, but Celeste and I were so close. We shared everything. I just didn't expect to have to share my boyfriend. The two of them deserve each other, her mother said. Lindy expected her mother to champion her. As far as I'm concerned, Brian isn't half the man we thought he was, her mother continued. It's painful for you now, I remember. She paused. You remember what? Her mother's eyes darkened with sadness. I remember how I felt when your birth father walked out on me. It seemed as if the entire world had collapsed around me. As soon as he learned I was pregnant with you, he took off for the hills. He couldn't get away fast enough. Oh, Mom, Lindy whispered. Looking at it from her mother's point of view, Lindy had gotten off lucky. Scooting back her chair, Ellen gestured for Lindy to remain where she was. There's something I want to show you. Show me. Something that will make you feel better. While that sounded promising, Lindy wasn't sure anything her mother had to show her would lift her spirits from this funk. Her mother disappeared and returned a few minutes later. With a big smile, she handed Lindy a child-sized shoe box. What's that? She asked, genuinely puzzled, not knowing what to expect. Her mother's face glowed with excitement. I went through some of those boxes I packed away in the garage years ago and found this. I've been saving it to show you. These, my precious daughter, are your letters to Santa. While they might amuse me, Mom, I doubt they will do anything to take away this ache in my heart. I think you might be surprised, her mother insisted. Now, open it up and read the first letter. Lindy couldn't imagine anything she'd written back when she believed in Santa had the power to influence her life now. Trust me, her mother whispered. Read the one on the top. You wrote it when you were 5. This is silly. Still, she couldn't help being curious. Don't be so sure, her mother said, with a twinkle in her eye. Chapter 2. Lindy had a hard time believing her childhood letters to Santa had any significance to her current messy life. Nevertheless, she was curious, and reached for the letter at the top of the box. Opening the envelope, she pulled a single sheet from inside and spread it out on the table. In her childish, awkward print she'd written, Dear Santa, please bring me a daddy. Lindy. Lindy glanced at her mother and smiled. I didn't ask for toys. I can remember wanting a bike around that time. That came later. All you wanted that Christmas was a dad. I don't remember any of this. Honey, you were only 5. You'd started kindergarten, and for the first time noticed that the other children had fathers and you didn't. Lindy shook her head. She had little recollection of that Christmas. What she did remember was that bike. As she thought back, she realized her mother was right in that all she had asked for was a dad. I remember when I read your letter. No way was I going to be able to give you a father. My heart sank, her mother said. The only man I'd ever loved had left me. I hadn't heard from him since the day I told him I was pregnant. Through some friends of mine, I learned he'd married someone else shortly after you were born. We were far better off without him. Lindy believed that with all her heart. She wouldn't have had the father who loved and raised her if this sperm donor had stuck around, although at the time she understood how his rejection must have badly hurt her mother. Over the years, Lindy hadn't wondered about him herself. Because she was loved by the dad who'd adopted her, she'd never felt the need to know anything about the man responsible for her birth. We are much better off, her mother agreed. Of all the things you might have asked for, a father was the one thing I couldn't give you. It broke my heart. Oh, Mom, I'm so sorry. You need to understand. That year Christmas was bleak. My parents left to spend the holidays with my brother in Kansas, and it was just the two of us. With everything in me, I wanted to make this special for you. Because you were going to miss Gamma and Papa. Lindy knew how dearly her mother loved Christmas, and how hard it must have been for her to be alone, instead of with her family. And then Lindy had to ask for the one thing her mother couldn't provide. *****. Relaxing against the back of the chair, Ellen's memories returned to that fateful Christmas. With her parents gone, she was alone over the holidays for the first time in her life. She'd done everything she could think of to make it as perfect as she could for her little girl. With a single income, making ends meet was difficult. Christmas Eve she sat up until nearly midnight, wrapping the few gifts she was able to put under the tree for Lindy. All the while, she regretted that she wouldn't be able to give her beautiful daughter the one thing she'd so desperately wanted: a daddy. Trust was a huge issue with her after what happened with Robbie. He'd said all the right things, lavished her with compliments, seduced her, and then once he got what he wanted, he changed. His calls became infrequent, and when he did show up there was only one thing that interested him. All the signs were there, only she'd been blind. So blind. His promises were empty, and when she learned she was pregnant, the truth hit her square between the eyes. How grateful Ellen was for her parents, who loved her and helped support her through the pregnancy. After Lindy was born, they'd helped her get into a small apartment. Robbie had abandoned her and claimed he wanted nothing to do with his daughter. With that attitude, Ellen made the painful decision to cut him completely out of their lives. Robbie was more than happy to sign away all parental rights, which meant he didn't need to pay child support. Consequently, Ellen struggled financially. Still, she'd been determined to make this a good Christmas for her daughter. Due to her parents' generosity, there were plenty of gifts under the tree for Lindy to open. Christmas morning, Lindy roared out of bed and raced barefoot to the Christmas tree, sliding toward it like she was running for first base. "Can we open gifts now?" she pleaded. Ellen brewed herself a cup of tea and smiled as Lindy opened one small gift after another. "Mommy, look, Gamma and Papa got me a baking oven." "Wonderful. You can bake a cake for our Christmas dinner." Lindy set the gift aside and reached for another package. Tearing away the wrapping, she groaned a sigh. "It's underwear." "Yes, look how pretty it is. No one is supposed to see it though." Ellen constrained her amusement. "You're right. You shouldn't show anyone your new pretty underwear." After 3 or 4 presents, Lindy settled back on her feet and looked expectantly at Ellen. "What's the matter, honey? Don't you like your gifts?" Lindy was quick to nod. "I do. I wanted that bake oven forever and I love the new game and my puzzle. But Santa didn't answer my letter." "I know, honey, and I'm sorry. Do you want to play with your new game?" Lindy was quick to agree, and the two played several games before Ellen cooked them breakfast. Afterward, they watched Ellen's favorite Christmas movies, and they talked to her parents and brother in Kansas City. Joe asked if his gifts had arrived, and when she said they hadn't, he apologized for mailing them off so late. When they were off the phone, Lindy mixed up the batter for a small cake to bake in her new oven. Because it was just the two of them, Ellen roasted a chicken for their dinner. The scent of it drifted through their apartment. "Chicken is my favorite," Lindy said, as she patiently waited for her cake to finish cooking. She sat in front of the tiny oven and stared at it, watching the small timer tick away. "Chicken with mashed potatoes and gravy." "And peas," Lindy insisted. "And peas." Lindy liked to squish them up with her potatoes and then add the gravy. It was while she was peeling the potatoes for their dinner that the doorbell rang. Before Ellen could put down the knife, Lindy was on her feet. Mommy, maybe it's Santa." Before Ellen could stop her, Lindy raced to the front door and threw it open. "Did Santa send you?" she asked with wide-eyed expectation. "I believe he did," the man said as Ellen stepped out of the kitchen. "Are you my daddy?" Lindy asked. She whirled around, her eyes bright with joy. "See, Mommy, Santa got my letter after all." Ellen's face flushed red with embarrassment, and she avoided looking at the man in the doorway. "Ellen!" She glanced up and stared. "Philip? What are you doing here?" She didn't mean to sound unwelcoming. She'd known Philip in high school and hadn't seen him since they'd graduated. "I work for UPS." She should have realized that, as he was dressed in his brown uniform. "You deliver on Christmas?" He shrugged. "All the other drivers are married with families. I'm single and volunteer to do the deliveries," thinking some little girl might be waiting for a gift from Santa. With that, he handed the package to Lindy. "I believe this one is addressed to your mom and you." Lindy grabbed hold of the boxed gift. Philip smiled. "I should confess I recognized your name and saved your package for last." "Please come in where it's warm," she said, when she realized this was his last stop. Ellen remembered that Philip had always been shy. "It's just the two of you?" he asked, looking around. Ellen nodded. "Mom and Dad are with my brother in Kansas City." Lindy was sitting on the floor, opening the package, which was from Lindy's godmother. Inside was a doll for Lindy and another package wrapped for Ellen. "I suppose you're in a rush to get back to your family," Ellen said. Philip shook his head. My parents are with my grandparents in Yakima. In other words, he was alone on Christmas too. It isn't much, but would you like to join us for dinner? Ellen asked. I mean, if you want. No pressure. I'd like that more than I can say. His eyes held hers and they were filled with promise. Shaking her head to clear the memories, Ellen's gaze returned to Lindy, who was staring down at the letter she'd written all those years ago. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Dad arrived that Christmas Day, Lindy whispered. Yes, it was your daddy, the very daddy you'd asked Santa to bring you. I don't remember writing Santa, Lindy said, running her finger over the clumsily drawn letters. But I certainly recall you and Dad dating and how patient and kind he was to me. Don't you remember me saying your dad was the best Christmas present I ever received? Yes, but I had no idea his arrival that day had anything to do with my letter to Santa. I mean, that's a stretch, isn't it? More of a coincidence. You might not think so if you read the remainder of the letters. I will, but I want to hear more about that Christmas when I was 5. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Oh, the memories. Phil had returned for dinner after dropping off the UPS truck. Once again, Lindy hurried to the front door, grabbing his hand and pulling him inside the house. Ellen had the table set and had refreshed her makeup. She remembered the shy looks he'd given her back in school. He'd never asked her out. If he'd found the nerve, she would have gladly accepted. Mommy's a good cook, Lindy told him. Almost as good as Gamma. Lindy led him to the sofa and then sat down next to him. I'm 5 and I can read. You must be very smart. Do you want me to read you a story? I would. Ellen was flustered. Lindy, let's wait until after dinner, okay? She looked disappointed but agreed. Okay, I got pretty underwear for Christmas, but Mommy said I'm not supposed to show it to people. Your mommy is a wise woman. Ellen coughed. If she was wise, she wouldn't have ended up as a single mother. She's pretty too. Yes, she is, Philip agreed. I've always thought so. For the next several minutes Lindy chatted away, as if she'd saved every experience from the first 5 years of her life to tell him. He was wonderful, patient and attentive. And that Christmas Day was only the beginning. Philip quickly became a part of Ellen and Lindy's life. And as Ellen had so often said, he was the best Christmas present ever. And then later Dad adopted me, Lindy said. That he did. We were married the next summer, and within a few months after our wedding, he legally became your father. I'm pretty sure I know why you saved that letter to Santa, Lindy teased. Open the next one, her mother urged. Chapter 3. Reaching inside the small shoebox, Lindy withdrew the next letter. Unfolding it, she spread the paper out on the table and read aloud. Dear Santa, thank you for my daddy. Mommy has a baby in her tummy, and I would like a baby sister and rollerblades. Lindy, I got my rollerblades but I didn't get my sister. Instead we got Chad. I don't think you were disappointed though, her mother reminded her. No. The way I figured it, Santa knew what he was doing when he sent Chad. I remember Dad taking me to the hospital to see him. I had to stand on my tippy toes to look into the nursery. The instant I set eyes on him I knew in my heart of hearts that deep down, I really wanted a little brother. Santa had come through after all. From the time her parents brought Chad home from the hospital, Lindy had doted on him. She couldn't bear to hear him cry and did whatever she could to entertain him. Although there was a 6-year difference in their ages, Lindy and Chad had developed a special bond that continued to this day. I don't know that I can wait until Thursday to see him, Lindy said. Her brother and his small family came regularly for dinner Thursday night, which was her brother's day off from the warehouse. Ashley is only working part-time, so I'm sure if you give her a call, you'll be able to connect. Will do. Lindy couldn't wait to see her brother and Ashley, although her nephew Peter was the real draw. That kid had had her heart from the first moment she'd held him in her arms. He gazed up at her and their eyes had linked. From then on Lindy was a lost cause. Chad and Ashley had married young. Chad had told Lindy he knew right away that Ashley would one day be his wife. Even as a teenager, Ashley said she felt the same about Chad. Without question he was the one for her. If Lindy didn't love them so much she could almost be jealous. Intrigued now, she reached into the box for the next letter, opening it and setting it down on the table beside the other two. Her printing had gotten much better, she noticed. I wrote this when I was 7, she said, reading it aloud. Dear Santa, I'm glad I got a brother instead of a sister. Chad is cute when he isn't crying. I like my rollerblades too. I go out every day when it doesn't rain. I want a magic marker pen set and a fashion Barbie this year. Oh, and you should give Billy Kincaid coal. He's mean. He pulls my hair at school and chases me at recess. Lindy. Lindy looked up at her mother when she finished reading the letter. As I recall, I got my wish that year. Yes, you did, her mother said. And you colored until your fingers were every shade of the rainbow. What I remember is Chad grabbing my masterpiece and shoving it into his mouth before anyone could stop him. Memories rolled past her like scenes on a silent movie screen. She vividly remembered Billy Kincaid and how much she disliked him. He'd been a year or two ahead of her in school. Not a day passed when he didn't find some way to torment her. Once he even stole her homework. At recess he made a point of chasing her. To her he was the meanest boy in school. Lindy didn't remember writing Santa about him. At the mention of his name, thoughts of Billy Kincaid were fresh in her mind. Whatever happened to Billy? Her mother asked. Lindy didn't have a clue. I don't remember him beyond second grade. He must have transferred to another school. As far as she was concerned, good riddance. She hadn't thought about him since grade school. I remember you complained about him, her mother recalled. I ended up going to the school principal to find out what the deal was. You did. Maybe that was the reason Billy had transferred schools, not that she cared. Lindy was simply happy to have him out of her life. Dad came with me and spoke to Billy privately. Afterward, your father said he felt the reason Billy paid you all that attention was because he had a crush on you. If that's true, then he had a curious way of showing it. Boys are difficult to understand. It was likely something happening in his home life. Maybe he was attracted to you and didn't know how to show it. Save me from boys who have a crush on me then, Lindy said, thinking of Brian. Nothing had changed through the years as far as she could tell. One last letter remained. Lindy was 8 at the time. Dear Santa. My friend Peggy has a bicycle with tassels and a basket with a flower in the front. Can you bring me one just like hers? Thank you. Lindy. Her handwriting had greatly improved by then, she noticed. A smile was hard to hold back as she set aside the letter. What's so funny? Her mother asked. By 8 I knew Santa was all fun. I wrote that letter so you and Dad knew what I really wanted for Christmas. And you got your wish, didn't you? I did, and I loved that bike. Peggy and I rode all over the neighborhood on our twin bikes. Her mother focused her attention on Lindy. Have you noticed a pattern here? She asked, glancing down at the letters. Lindy's eyes followed her mother's. Well, other than Santa answering my Christmas wishes, not really. She certainly didn't see anything of significance. While interesting and fun to review, these were nothing more than childish letters. Look again, her mother advised. Lindy glanced down at the 4 letters in front of her. What am I supposed to be looking for? She asked. You don't see it, do you? Obviously she didn't. When I read your letters, her mother continued, I noticed nearly everything you asked Santa to bring you he did. Not always in the way you wanted, but in a way that was better. Looking over her scribbles, Lindy frowned. Mom, come on. You and Dad got me all the gifts I wanted. To be fair, yes, but remember you wanted a dad, and Santa sent Phil to our front door on Christmas Day. True enough. She couldn't deny it. She'd gotten the daddy she'd asked for, along with a brother. And Billy Kincaid had disappeared after she told Santa he deserved coal for Christmas. Plus, she got her own bicycle, the one with pink tassels on the handlebars. She'd ridden it into the ground. While she might not have gotten the sister she requested, she willingly forgave Santa. What she did get was a friend her own age in Peggy. You know what I think, her mother said. My guess is that you're going to tell me. I think you need to write Santa another letter. What? Come on, Mom. Don't you think I'm a bit old to believe in Santa Claus? Her mother shook her head. The word you need to seriously consider is believe. Her words gave Lindy pause. She'd been in an emotional rut for so long. It was hard to look at the positive in any situation. Reading those old letters had been fun, and they reminded her that at one time she had believed with all her heart. She'd looked forward to each Christmas with happy anticipation, knowing her wishes would be granted. After hearing everything that's been going on in your life with Brian and Celeste, plus Media Blast, writing Santa might not be such a bad idea. Maybe a letter letting him know what you'd like most this Christmas is exactly what you need to do. And write it with the same trust you had as a child. It sounded silly for someone her age to be writing Santa. Lindy, her mother prompted. I'll think on it, she said, not wanting to dampen her mother's enthusiasm, and at the same time finding the suggestion completely ridiculous. She struggled to believe in the magic of Christmas. If anyone learned she'd followed through with such an outrageous idea, she'd be embarrassed. Later that same afternoon, Lindy helped her mother prepare dinner. Peeling potatoes, she found herself mulling over the silly Santa letters she'd penned as a kid. Her mother was right about one thing. She needed to believe that everything happened for a reason. She was glad Brian had shown his true colors before their relationship went any further. Although difficult, Celeste should have been honest with her. It would have hurt, but not nearly as much as discovering their betrayal the way she had. In retrospect, Lindy had to wonder how long they'd hid their affair. Weeks surely. Weeks before her move, Lindy noticed changes in Brian before Celeste. He didn't call as often, and when they did get together he seemed distracted. She'd attributed his lack of attentiveness to any number of factors. To be fair to herself, with her work struggles, her mind had been preoccupied. In contrast, Celeste was her normal cheery self. She hadn't given anything away. It stunned Lindy how naive she'd been, how trusting. When confronted, Celeste had nothing to say and Lindy didn't seem to either. After those first awkward minutes, Celeste blurted out that she was sorry. Lindy didn't stick around to hear anything more. She'd left and they hadn't spoken since, and that had been months ago. Losing her best friend had been a major blow. They'd been as close as sisters, Lindy thought. Best friends. They'd done everything together for so long that losing Celeste was like missing her right arm. But friends, true friends, didn't betray each other. If Lindy were to write Santa, which she had no intention of doing, she'd ask for a new best friend. She'd also ask him to send her a new love interest. One with character and substance. A man with integrity. She wasn't so much interested in tall, dark, and handsome. Brian had been all three. Looks didn't matter nearly as much as what was going on inside his heart. A man with heart. In thinking about it, she wasn't sure Santa or anyone else would be able to grant Lindy her wish. Chapter 4. The door off the garage opened. "Is my girl home?" Lindy's father asked. He paused long enough to kiss Ellen and then hug Lindy. "Missed you," he said, his eyes full of love. "You're home early," Ellen said, as she continued to build the dinner salad, adding a sliced pear and chopped walnuts. Lindy knew that as supervisor of the local UPS center, her father didn't often return home until 6 or even 7, especially at this time of year. "I left early. I didn't want to miss out on time with my baby girl." "Dad, I'm hardly a baby." "You'll always be my sweet pea," he countered. Yup, this was home, and the love that surrounded her eased the ache in Lindy's heart. Opening the cookie jar, her dad reached for a thumbprint and headed to the countertop to sort the mail. After he went through everything, he looked to Ellen. "Did you show Lindy the Santa letters?" "I did." "What did you think, sweet pea?" he asked. She shrugged. "It was fun going over them with Mom. And to think she saved them all these years." "Astonishing, really," Lindy said. Lindy spent the evening with her parents, catching up on everything she'd missed since her last visit. Her parents headed to bed at 10, and after calling her brother and planning to connect, Lindy went to her own room. Bo leaped onto her mattress and cuddled up at the foot of her bed. She intended to read as she did most nights. Sitting up in bed, her blankets gathered around her, with a book in her hands was how she normally ended her days. Instead of being drawn into the story, her thoughts drifted over the unexpected events of the day. Most likely, she wasn't going to be able to concentrate. Turning out the light, she tossed and turned for the next hour. Then, giving up, she turned the nightstand lamp on and sat up. Knowing it was useless, she got out of bed, rummaging through her desk drawer until she found a tablet and a pen. She looked down at the blank page and wrote, "Dear Santa, it's Lindy. I hope you haven't forgotten me after all these years. Checking in to let you know this hasn't been the best year of my life. Don't worry, I'm not going to ask for world peace. My request should be right up your alley, if a bit out of the ordinary. Could you kindly introduce me to a man like the one you brought my mother all those years ago? A man who values family and commitment. One who is trustworthy and honorable, hardworking, caring, and fun. It'd help if he was fond of children, too. I know he's out there somewhere, and frankly, I don't want to wait until I get to heaven to meet him. I could do with another good friend. One I can pal around with and share secrets. One with a sense of humor and adventure. Just wondering if you could clone Peggy? I'm grateful to work with Media Blast, and be able to use the talents God gave me. If I were to have my latest proposal accepted, I know it would greatly advance my career. I'll leave it to you to get working on the list and thank you in advance. You've never disappointed me in the past." With her letter written, Lindy felt ready to sleep. A smile came over her as she rested her head against her pillow. Who would have thought she'd think to write Santa beyond the age of 8? Life was full of wonders. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. "Did you sleep well?" her mother asked, as Lindy stumbled out of her bedroom at 7:30 the following morning. "I did." Truly, she was amazed at how well she had slept. Once she'd written Santa, she'd experienced a feeling of peace. It was probably the silliest thing she'd done in ages, but she couldn't discount the contentment that came over her after she'd penned the letter. "I've got my book club meeting this afternoon," her mother said, sounding almost apologetic. Barely listening, Lindy brewed herself a cup of coffee, opening the refrigerator to add creamer. "It's our Christmas party," her mother continued. "Would you like to join me?" Leaning her backside against the kitchen counter, Lindy blew into the hot coffee and shook her head. "Thanks, Mom, but if you don't mind, I thought I'd run a couple of errands this morning, and then I'm meeting Chad for lunch on his break." "Of course. I didn't want you to feel like I was ignoring you." "Don't be silly. Go and have fun. I'm capable of entertaining myself for a few hours." Lindy was touched by her mother's thoughtfulness, although it didn't surprise her. Asterisk. After a lazy morning, Lindy met up with her brother at the Wenatchee warehouse. Chad had gotten his degree from Central Washington University in supply chain management. He'd always had great organizational skills and enjoyed his job. They headed over to the local diner and talked nonstop for nearly 45 minutes. Chad filled her in on his and Ashley's plans for the holidays, and Lindy was pleased to know she'd have plenty of time to spend with them and Peter. Knowing she'd need to update him on her own life, she gave him a brief rundown of what had been going on with her. When he heard about Brian and Celeste, she watched as the anger tightened his face. "I hate that you had to go through that, sis," Chad said, his dark eyes full of sympathy. "It's over, I've moved on." "Good. Glad to hear it." They hugged outside the diner, and as she walked toward where she'd parked her car, she realized it hadn't been an exaggeration. She felt free of the disappointment and hurt she'd carried on her shoulders these last 6 months. Her next stop was at the local dry cleaner. She had a few items she wanted pressed and hadn't had time to have it done before she left Seattle. When she finished, she noticed a Starbucks had opened on the tail end of the strip mall. A peppermint latte sounded good, and she headed in that direction. After ordering a salad for lunch, she was in the mood for something sweet and hot. As she stood in line, Lindy noticed the tall, slim, fashionably dressed black woman in front of her. The woman turned to ask her friend something, and Lindy thought she looked vaguely familiar. By the time Lindy placed her order, she was afraid she was staring at the woman, debating if she should introduce herself. No, that was silly. It couldn't possibly be who she thought it was. The only black person she knew from Wenatchee had been her childhood friend, Peggy. After collecting her drink, Lindy headed for the door, not wanting to look foolish if it wasn't who she thought. "Lindy, is that you?" The question came at her from the table close to the exit. "Peggy? It couldn't be. Peggy Scranton? Lindy? Lindy Carmichael." Lindy started to laugh. Really, what were the chances? "Peggy. Oh my goodness, how long has it been?" Peggy smiled and gestured for Lindy to join her and her friend. Since right before middle school. Peggy had been one of Lindy's closest friends from 2nd grade on. The trouble they'd gotten into was epic. The summer between grade school and middle school, Peggy's family had moved into a new development on the other side of town. Peggy had enrolled in a different school. For the first few months, they were able to keep in contact and maintain their friendship. As time went on, they grew apart. Over the years, Lindy had wondered what had ever happened to her grade school friend. "This is Jane," Peggy said, introducing her friend, a blonde, blue-eyed woman who looked to be about their age. "Hi, I'm Lindy. Lindy and I were the best of friends eons ago," Peggy explained. The two started to exchange stories from their youth, entertaining Jane, who had a bright, easy laugh. "Remember the time we decided to form our own band?" Peggy asked. "We were doomed to failure since neither of us could play a musical instrument or sing. Not that we let that stop us." "Hey, I can sing," Lindy insisted, although only rarely on key. Peggy smiled. "Since we clearly weren't going to make it as rock stars, we launched a neighborhood newspaper." "A gossip tabloid is more like it," Lindy clarified. "We certainly didn't lack for originality. Remember that 4th of July when we decided to put on our own parade?" Peggy asked. "Indeed I do." That idea had been one of their few successes. Peggy's 2 older siblings had come along, and then Chad and his friends had joined the line with their bicycles. Peggy carried the American flag, waving it from side to side as Lindy beat a toy drum. Soon, several of the other neighborhood kids raced to become part of the fun. They didn't have much of an audience, but none of that mattered. "And remember when you decided to straighten my hair?" Peggy asked. Looking to Jane, she explained. "Lindy used a flat iron and started my hair on fire." Lindy nearly snorted her latte, laughing. She'd felt dreadful afterward, and thinking it would help, she chopped off nearly all of Peggy's hair. Then she had Peggy cut her hair so they would look alike. Even at that early age, she knew she would never make it through beauty school. After wiping the tears from her eyes, she asked, "You're living here in Wenatchee?" "Peggy is the editor and journalist for the local magazine Wenatchee Alive," Jane answered. "She does an excellent job too." "Oh my goodness, and to think you started your literary career with me as your assistant editor," Lindy joked. "Jane makes me sound like I'm writing for the New York Times. It's a local publication with a small but dedicated staff." "What about you?" Peggy asked. "Don't tell me you're here in Wenatchee and it's taken us this long to reconnect." Lindy shook her head. "Seattle. I'm home for Christmas." "How long will you be in town?" "Nearly 2 weeks, unless I hear back on a proposal I submitted. That's unlikely though." 2 weeks. Perfect. Just think of the ruckus we can raise in that amount of time. "You should join us tonight," Jane said, looking to Peggy, who eagerly nodded agreement. "What's tonight?" "Girls' night out," Jane said. "We're heading for drinks at the Wine Press." "Is that a new place in town?" Lindy couldn't remember hearing anything about a new restaurant while she was home last summer. "It's been around for a couple months now. It's the in place to go for fun. And the wine choices are excellent," Jane added. "The owner features Washington state wines. It's surprising how many good wines come from our state." General knowledge told her Washington was the largest wine-producing state outside of California. She wasn't surprised to learn the wine press chose to highlight state wineries. It was smart to support the local economy. "Do you have other plans?" Jane asked, and seemed genuine in her wanting Lindy to join them. "Nothing important. I'd love to meet your friends." "You'll meet Chloe," Peggy told her. "She's a supervisor for Costco." They stayed and talked for another hour before agreeing to meet later for drinks and appetizers. While they were together, Peggy called and made reservations at the wine press for that evening at 6 o'clock. Her mother was back by the time Lindy returned from her errands. She must have been smiling when she walked in the door, because her mother commented right away, "It looks like you had an entertaining afternoon. You won't believe who I ran into while I was out. Peggy Scranton. We were just talking about her, remember?" "Peggy Scranton," her mother repeated slowly. "That's wonderful. The two of you were such good friends back in the day." "Peggy invited me to join her this evening with a couple of her other friends for a girls' night out. Peggy's single and so is Jane, but Chloe's married." Lindy looked forward to spending time with Peggy's friends. Working the long hours she had on the project for the Ferguson group, she hadn't been out with friends in ages. Although Lindy hadn't spoken to Peggy in years, it was as if they'd never spent time apart. They both fell right back into the easy friendship they'd once shared. "I remember when you and Peggy were inseparable," her mother said, interrupting Lindy's musings. "She was one of my best friends ever." That evening, as Lindy readied for meeting Peggy and her friends at the wine press, she paused long enough to open her nightstand. She removed the tablet with the letter she'd written Santa the night before. One of the things she'd asked Santa was to bring her a new best friend. "Gotta say, Santa, you're good. You're really good." Chapter 5. When Lindy arrived, Peggy, Jane, and Chloe were already seated. Peggy waved her over, and following introductions, the server delivered a bottle of wine to their table. With the ease of someone accustomed to opening wine, he removed the cork and filled their glasses. "The wine is on me," Peggy said, before anyone could argue. "I have my two best friends with me, and I've reconnected with Lindy. This calls for a celebration." They toasted one another by gently clinking their glasses together. Peggy had chosen a rich red wine with a low tannin that went down way too easy. Lindy looked at the label and decided a bottle or two would make an excellent Christmas gift for her dad, who enjoyed red wine as much as Lindy did. All the tables around them were full. Peggy had been right. The restaurant was hopping with a brisk business. With the four of them, there was no shortage of conversation. The server returned and asked if they were interested in any of the appetizers. "Can you give us a few minutes?" Peggy asked. "Of course, ladies. Take your time." Once Lindy read the menu, it didn't take her long to decide on hummus with pitas. She'd need food in her stomach before she drank much more wine. Peggy ordered the crab dip and Jane and Chloe decided to share the spicy grilled shrimp. A few minutes later, their server returned and took their orders. Lindy added a second bottle of wine to go with their food. She requested another red, this time from a different vineyard. "Excellent choice," the server said, approving of her selection. It was as she handed the young man the menu that Lindy happened to notice the name of the proprietor and manager. "Will Kincaid. You know who that is, don't you?" Peggy asked. Lindy hadn't realized she'd said the name aloud. She shook her head and frowned. "You couldn't possibly mean Billy Kincaid, could you?" "One and the same." Lindy was shocked. The Billy she knew had been a terror. A bully she'd intensely disliked. Having him move away had been the best thing to happen to her in second grade. Billy had a huge crush on Lindy, Peggy explained to Jane and Chloe. If pulling my hair and terrorizing me indicates liking me, I can't imagine what he would have done if he saw me as a threat. You might remember I slugged him once defending you, Peggy reminded her. Lindy had forgotten that. You were my hero that day. Billy only recently moved back to town, Peggy said, apparently in the know. From what I heard, he came here from the Yakima area. You remember someone from the second grade? Jane commented, sounding impressed. That's what's so crazy, Lindy went on to explain. Perhaps it was the wine making her head spin. This is unreal. What is? Lindy shook her head as if to clear her mind. When I arrived yesterday, my mother brought out this box she'd found buried in the garage from years ago. Inside were letters I'd written to Santa. I hadn't thought about Billy in forever, but I mentioned him in one of those letters. We should ask Billy to come to the table, Peggy said. Before Lindy could protest, Peggy got the server's attention. The young man quickly returned to their table. Is Mr. Kincaid available? She asked. The server immediately showed his concern. Was there something wrong with your appetizers, ladies? No, not at all. We know him from school. Tell him Lindy Carmichael is here. Peggy, Lindy said, and groaned under her breath. I wish you hadn't done that. Go get Will, Peggy insisted. The server nodded. I'll check if he's available. Oh please, Lindy said in an effort to stop him. That isn't necessary. I'm sure he doesn't remember me. You wrote Santa about Billy? Jane asked. What did you say? This was more than a little embarrassing. I told Santa Billy didn't deserve any gifts this year, and that he should bring him coal instead. The three laughed. It was mean of me, but Billy had intimidated me at school, and I guess it was the only way I could think to retaliate. No sooner had the words left her mouth than a man approached their table with a welcoming smile. Leaning forward, he braced his hands against the back of Jane's and Chloe's chairs. Lindy's mouth sagged open. It was Billy Kincaid, the same Billy Kincaid from her youth. How she could be this certain she didn't know. But deep down there wasn't a single doubt. Because Lindy was completely tongue-tied, Peggy spoke up. You remember Lindy, don't you? His eyes automatically landed on her with such intensity it made her want to squirm. And you were her ardent protector as I recall, Billy said, grinning at Peggy. Good to see you both. You too, Peggy said. Lindy half raised her hand. Hello, Billy. She had to admit Billy Kincaid had matured into a fine figure of a man. He stood a good 6 feet tall. If his tight chest and muscular arms were any indication, he was physically fit. His eyes were a deep brown, mirroring the color of her own eyes. His hair was cut close on the sides and long on top, gathered into a neat man bun. Did you know Lindy wrote about you in her letter to Santa when she was in second grade? Chloe said. Lindy would gladly have disappeared in that moment. The last thing she wanted to discuss was that silly letter. She regretted ever mentioning it. Did you now? Billy's full attention was focused on her, a smile teasing his sensuous mouth. You weren't exactly my favorite person, she mumbled. Billy crossed his arms and smiled down at Lindy. And what could I have done to earn your wrath? He asked, as if he didn't recall a single offense he'd committed against her. Lindy was convinced he did remember, and she wasn't going to let him pretend otherwise. You know good and well what you did, Billy Kincaid. Tell him what you said in your letter to Santa, Jane urged. Lindy wasn't interested in confessing her embarrassing childish rant. It's stupid. Billy doesn't want to hear about that. Oh, but I do, he countered. She should have kept her mouth shut earlier. Given no choice, she confessed. I asked Santa to bring you a stocking full of coal because that was what you deserved. What year was this? He asked, frowning. Lindy told him. She was in second grade and he was a much bigger fourth grader. His face grew tight. Well, Lindy, you most definitely got your wish. That was the year our father deserted the family. There was no Christmas for Dee Dee or me. Mom had to move us in with her parents in Yakima. Oh no. Lindy felt terrible. I'm so sorry. Billy's smile lacked humor. That was a long time ago. Besides, I probably deserved coal instead of presents, so no harm done. Now, if you ladies will excuse me. He left, and Lindy felt the strongest urge to follow him and apologize. Chapter 6. For as soundly as Lindy had slept Friday night, she tossed and turned on Saturday. The terrible Christmas Billy had had that fateful year kept running through her mind. It was beyond ridiculous to believe her letter had anything to do with what had happened to him and his family. As illogical as it was to assume she was somehow responsible, Lindy couldn't stop thinking about all the 10-year-old had suffered. A child his age couldn't possibly understand what had happened to his father, or why he had left. When Lindy finally managed to fall asleep, her dreams were filled with Billy Kincaid and her as children. She spitefully complained to Santa about him, and in turn Santa promised to make Billy's life miserable. Lindy woke in a sweat when her mother knocked on her bedroom door. "Are you awake?" her mother asked, opening the door and peeking inside. "Yes." Lindy sat up in bed and rubbed the sleep from her eyes. She was wide awake now, and grateful for the interruption to her nightmare. "It's time to get ready for church," her mother told her. "I thought church was at 11. That had been the traditional time for worship service for as long as she could remember. Pastor added an early service, which we prefer. Your dad said Pastor Dean can't go overtime when he's got another service following on the heels of the first." "Okay, early service it is," Lindy said, and tossed aside the bed covers. "I forgot to tell you about the schedule change yesterday. Then Dad and I were asleep when you arrived home last night. Hope you had a good time with Peggy and her friends." "The best." After they'd left the wine press, Peggy invited Lindy to hang out at her apartment for several hours. It had been well after midnight before she arrived back home. Renewing their friendship was exactly the boost her Christmas spirit needed. They laughed about old times and, after reviewing more of their escapades, decided it was probably a good thing Peggy had moved away when she did. Only heaven knew the trouble they would have inspired had they continued on through middle and high school. After coffee and a quick shower, Lindy was ready to leave for church with her parents. As she walked out of the house, she noticed a bowl of sourdough pancake batter on the kitchen counter. Her dad had set it up the night before, the same as he'd done when she lived at home. Sourdough rolls and now pancakes. Lindy loved being home. Church was exactly what she needed to lift her out of the blue funk following her dream. Seeing people she'd known most of her life lifted her spirits, as did singing the traditional Christmas carols. This was the last service before the traditional Christmas Eve candlelight one. Pastor Dean's message was on forgiveness and the necessity of letting go of petty hurts, which was exactly what Lindy needed to hear. Closing her eyes, she released Celeste and Brian, and although it was difficult, she wished them happiness. After church, as her dad delivered steaming hotcakes to the middle of the table, Lindy eagerly piled 4 small ones onto her plate and ladled warm maple syrup over the top until the sticky goodness pooled there. Bo took his place beneath the table, hoping someone would be kind enough to share their bacon. Lindy knew her mother had a soft spot for Bo, and watched as Ellen slipped him a piece when Lindy's dad wasn't looking. "How was the food at the wine press?" her mother asked. "Dad and I have been meaning to make a reservation, but we haven't had a chance to just yet." Lindy knew how busy her father was this time of year, so the fact that they hadn't been out often came as no surprise. The appetizers were great, and the wine selection was diverse in both variety and price. Seeing how busy the restaurant was, there was no doubt it would be a success. There was only one negative to the night. "Oh, wasn't the service good?" "It was excellent. I happened to meet the owner/manager, and you'll never guess who it is." "I won't even try." "Tell me." "Billy Kincaid." "Billy Kincaid?" her mother repeated, as if she were as shocked as Lindy had been to hear the name. "Not the same Billy you mentioned in your letter to Santa?" "One and the same. When I recognized his name, I was foolish enough to mention that silly letter." Then, before I could stop her, Peggy asked if Billy would come to our table. She paused before continuing to relay what she'd learned about that horrible Christmas. "You make it sound like his father deserting the family was your fault," her dad said, helping himself to another stack of his much-loved hotcakes. "I do feel that way, and before you say anything, I know that's ridiculous. I could barely sleep last night, and when I did I had nightmares." "Billy wasn't upset when you told him about the letter, was he?" "Heavens no. What troubled me was when he talked about that Christmas. His eyes grew sad, as if it was one of the worst times of his life." Her mother grew still and quiet. "You should bake him cookies," she suggested, as if cookies would absolve Lindy of any residual guilt. "Mom, I don't think Christmas cookies are going to help." Her dad shook his head. "Don't discount your mother's gingerbread cookies, sweet pea." Lindy was amused and thoughtfully mulled over her mother's idea. Her grandmother's recipe for gingerbread cookies wasn't going to remove the pain she recognized in Billy. She knew that, but at the same time it was something she could do. A small kindness. She didn't have any plans for the afternoon. Later that evening, Peggy suggested they get together again, possibly take in a movie. Lindy was eager to spend more time with her long-lost friend and had agreed. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. It was gratifying how quickly Lindy had connected with her friend. Felt like old times. Returning to Peggy's following the movie, They shared wine and confidences. Lindy found it easy to tell Peggy about the situation with her job and her determination to succeed in Seattle. She'd always been driven, but rarely more so than she was with Media Blast. Almost from the first day she'd felt like an outsider. It wasn't until after the first month that she'd learned Lori, who'd been with the company 5 years, had also applied for the position. Instead, Media Blast went with Lindy, feeling their colleague had been cheated. The rest of the team resented Lindy. As a result, Lindy felt the pressing need to prove herself and her qualifications at every turn. After another glass of wine, she spilled the dirt about Celeste and Brian. Lindy learned Peggy had endured her own heartache. She'd been married then divorced when her alcoholic husband had run up thousands of dollars of debt, and then split town, leaving Peggy to deal with the creditors. It had taken her years to pay everything off. Monday afternoon, just after the wine press opened, Lindy arrived with a large plate of gingerbread cookies she'd baked on Sunday. When she'd mentioned what she intended to do, Peggy had agreed with her mother and said it would be a nice gesture. Besides, Billy, with his strong jaw and muscular shoulders, was handsome enough to be on the cover of a romance novel. Peggy seemed to think Billy might still have a thing for Lindy and joked that he might be tempted to chase her the way he'd done when she was in grade school. If that was the case, Lindy was half tempted to let him catch her. Nice gesture or not, once she arrived at the restaurant she was nervous. The hostess, a young attractive woman in her early 20s, greeted her with a welcoming smile. "A table for one?" she asked. "Actually, I'm here to see Billy Kincaid. Is he available?" "Do you mean Will?" "I knew him as Billy, but yes, I suppose he goes by Will these days." "Can I tell him who's asking?" "Of course. I'm Lindy Carmichael. We're old friends." That was a stretch, but it sounded good. She smiled, hoping it made her look believable. "If you'll wait here, I'll see if Mr. Kincaid is available." "Thank you." The short exchange didn't ease any of Lindy's nervousness. For half a second she was tempted to leave. It would be mortifying if Billy refused to see her, once he learned it was her. She was both relieved and tense when the hostess returned with Billy. He glanced at the plate in her hand and raised his brows in question. "Lindy," he said, as if he didn't understand what had prompted her visit. "What can I do for you?" Thrusting out the plate, she was embarrassed that the hostess was listening in on their conversation. It was bad enough that Billy looked frazzled and impatient. "I baked cookies because I wanted to apologize," she said, eager to have him take her guilt offering so she could leave. "Apologize?" he asked. "Whatever for?" He didn't take the plate. Not wanting anyone to overhear, she leaned forward and whispered, "That letter to Santa." Billy's face broke into a huge smile. "You're kidding, right?" "Well, actually, no. Come on back to the office. I could use a break. And bring those cookies with you." He started across the restaurant, leaving her to follow, which she did. His office was compact, and she could see that he'd been sitting at his computer. He brought in another chair and briefly left her. When he returned, he carried 2 coffee mugs and they sat across his desk from each other. Glancing appreciatively at the gingerbread cookies, Billy peeled back the cellophane and reached for one. "This wasn't necessary, but it's appreciated. It just so happens gingerbread cookies are my favorite. It's been years since I had homemade ones. Grandma's recipe never fails." She ate one herself. "You can rat me out to Santa every year if it means you'll bake me cookies," he teased. His humor relaxed her. "You've done a wonderful job with the wine press," she said, looking to keep the conversation flowing. "It's clearly a success. It might be even more of one, if I could get this website up and running." He glared at his computer, as if to blame the machine for his troubles. "You're doing it yourself?" "Yeah. You won't believe what those web designers want to charge me." Lindy hid a smile. "How's designing it yourself working for you?" "It's not. I thought if I read a couple books I should be able to set up a usable web page on WordPress. I mean, how hard could it be?" "Well, I found out it isn't as easy as it sounds. Would you mind if I took a look at what you've done thus far?" He hesitated. "You want to what?" "Billy, I design websites for a living. Ever heard of Media Blast?" He nodded. "They are the top Seattle web marketing company. I didn't even ask for a quote, because I knew they'd be way out of my price range. I work for them. I'd be happy to look at what you have and advise you," she offered, grateful for the opportunity to do more than bake him cookies. "Before you do, I need to know your fees." "You're in luck," she said brightly, eager to get started. "The price is more than reasonable. I'll do it for free." He shook his head. "I can't let you do that." "Fine. How about a gift certificate for dinner and wine for my parents for Christmas? Done. He quickly vacated his chair and set her up in front of his computer. It didn't take long for Lindy to assess the work he'd completed, and she could see it would require only minor graphic changes but quite a bit of back-end work. He left her and returned later, pacing as he glanced over her shoulder. It didn't take him long to recognize Lindy knew what she was doing. She showed him a few easy tricks and went back to work. Do you need anything? He asked when he returned later. Lindy could hear the chatter from the lunch crowd that filled the restaurant. I'm good, thanks. She didn't move her eyes off the monitor as she worked. It was some time later that she noticed Billy had delivered a sandwich. Involved as she was, she ate half, hardly aware of what she tasted. Billy moved in and out of his office several times. He asked how she was doing, and left when she waved him away, promising she was doing fine and didn't need anything. Lindy was in her element. Her mother phoned to ask if Lindy planned to be home for dinner. Seeing that it was after 5, she was shocked to realize how long she'd been working. Save me a plate. I'm not sure how much longer I'll be, she said, after explaining where she was and what she was doing. Other than potty breaks and a couple of times when she stood to stretch, she was intent on her work. At 7, Billy insisted she stop. I'm almost finished, she objected. Tomorrow is soon enough. Although she didn't want to quit, he was right. Her eyes burned from staring at the monitor so long, and her back had started to ache. Come with me, Billy said, and scooted the roller chair away from the desk before she could complain. Where are we going? She stood, bent over, and touched her toes to loosen the muscles in her back. You asked too many questions. Billy reached for her hand, entwining their fingers. Without answering her, he led her through the kitchen to the far side of the restaurant and into a private dining room. The small round table was draped in a white linen cloth with a ring of holly around a burning candle in the center. A bottle of wine, 2 glasses, and dinnerware were artfully arranged. Billy pulled out the chair, silently inviting Lindy to take a seat. Soon after he was seated, 2 salad plates were delivered by the same server who had taken care of Lindy and her newfound friends on Saturday night. What is this? She asked, leaning close enough to the table for her stomach to press against the edge. It's the house salad, Billy said, as if it should be obvious. I mean this. She swung her arm out to indicate the room. You're feeding me dinner? He flashed her a boyish grin. It's the least I can do, Lindy. You've been working on that design for hours. But dinner in a private dining room? He glanced around as if the 2 of them alone came as a surprise. So it seems. Lindy felt like royalty. Wow, you should know I enjoy my work. This has been fun for me. I appreciate your help more than I can say. So tell me, how long have you been in the restaurant business? Lindy asked. She couldn't help being curious. From the time I was 16. Billy leaned forward as he spoke, his gaze warming as he continued. I started out as a dishwasher for a friend of my grandfather's who owned a diner in Yakima. Eventually I worked my way up, doing every job there was in the kitchen. Earl, my grandfather's friend, taught me nearly all there was to know about the ins and outs of restaurant ownership. I'll be forever grateful to him for mentoring me. I've had other mentors through the years, and am grateful for the time they put into teaching me what I would need to know. Earl is the one I owe the most. What about you? How is it you ended up in website design? Lindy had always been good with math and science, and that led her to a degree in computer science. The website design and the graphics came about later as she continued her studies. She'd been drawn into the creative part of designing websites, which led her to her job with Media Blast. Without going into a lot of detail, she casually described her work. You genuinely love it, don't you? I do, she said. And if my ideas are chosen on a current project, I will have proved my worth to the rest of the team. He frowned. You need to prove your worth? I got hired over someone who'd been with the company several years, and expected the position to be hers. She and the rest of the team haven't taken kindly to me. What she didn't mention was the extra hours she'd put in, the weekends she'd gone into the office, all in an effort to prove that management had made the right choice in hiring her. I have to admire your tenacity, Billy said. Media Blast is where I've always wanted to work. No way was I going to let a few disgruntled people drive me away. Good for you. Lindy didn't mean for the conversation to revolve around her. She wanted to know more about Billy. It's fun, running into you. Especially after Mom showed me those old letters to Santa. You mean to say you'd forgotten me? Not forgotten. Let's just say you slipped my mind. I'm here now, Lindy, and happy to see you. The intensity of his words and the way he looked at her caused her to blush. Thanks, Billy. It's good to connect with you too. Rarely had Lindy enjoyed a dinner more. The conversation flowed easily from one subject to the next, from their work to updating each other about their families. You say you're in town for the next 2 weeks? Billy asked. I've enjoyed the time we've spent together. How would you feel about getting together again? It might be at odd hours, though. The restaurant is my first priority. I'm hoping you won't mind working around that. Would you be willing? That sounds great. 2 weeks of letting go and having fun. No way was she turning down this opportunity. How would you feel about a trip to Leavenworth? It sounds perfect, she said. Really